reason the little clicker isn't working, but that's okay. I'm Ben Johnson. I am formerly, well, technically I'm still employed by Kennesaw State University, but I'm retiring at the end of September, and I bought all my time out at Kennesaw, and I'm now professor and chairman of the Department of Physical Education and Exercise Science at Brooklyn College in the City University of New York. Been there for about 3 weeks or so. I now know what a daughter is. You know what a daughter is?
Yeah.
Okay. And I say y'all and they say you guys. But it's been quite an interesting experience, and I look forward to my new career, but obviously staying in close contact with Blaze Sports. Today I'm going to talk about biomechanics of sports injury. Obviously, this is an area of concern for athletes with and without disabilities, but also with people that are just engaged in exercise. So the things that I'm going to talk about today are the things that apply across many aspects of life, and sport is one, but also occupational activities, activities of daily living, anything that engages the human body in human movement where forces are applied. Students that are studying physical education and exercise science, sports science, physical therapy, a variety of different sort of movement-related activities have to understand the physiology and the biomechanics of human movement. Understanding physiology from the standpoint of the energy systems that let the body move the way we need to move the body, whether it's an endurance sport, whether it's in aerobic activities that are more endurance related. But you also need to understand, when engaging in those sorts of activities, what kinds of forces are being applied by the body to make it move, and those forces have to come from within the body, so the musculoskeletal system. But then once the body starts moving in the environment, what are the forces from the environment back on the body? So physiology is more or less the chemistry applied to the body, whereas biomechanics is physics applied to the body. So I'm going to give you an overview of physics today as it relates to human movement. One of the basic concepts of biomechanics is understanding the interaction between force, motion, energy, and injury potential. So I'm hoping that this graphic here will sort of tell a story. Force has to be created from within the body, and then of course there has to be force outside the body from friction and various things that then let us move. That force will lead to motion. And that motion might be slower, it might be faster, it might be through a large range, it might be through a shorter range, depending upon the particular activity being moved. So once we've created motion, then that motion will lead to energy. So there's potential energy that's associated with gravity and with elastic forces. You know, if you compress a soccer ball and then let the force off, it will rebound back to its original shape. That's potential energy based on the elastic properties of the ball. Well, some of our internal tissues, our tendons, our ligaments, our connective tissues, etc., have similar sorts of potential energy, and we have to be able to appreciate that. Kinetic energy, though, is the energy associated with motion. And the formula for kinetic energy is 1/2 the mass of the object being moved times the velocity squared. So in that formula, obviously the mass or the size of the object is critical, and so relate that to the body. Bigger individuals have greater mass than smaller individuals. A 16-pound shot has more mass than a 12-pound shot. But what's really of most importance with that formula is velocity, because it can be widely variable, can be small, can be very high, but it's squared. And everybody can think back to the 6th grade math class or 7th grade math class where you started doing some higher level math and looking at the factors of squares and things of that nature. So small changes in velocity of movement can then lead to big increases in energy. And obviously, as we try to get athletes to move faster and to perform better, what we're also asking them to do is to create more kinetic energy. Well, that energy then can lead to injury. And we have to understand how all that has to be balanced out and taken care of so that we get out of our athletes what we need to get out of our athletes from a performance perspective, but we don't put them in harm's way and have injuries occur unnecessarily. Well, one of the primary formulas that we need to understand when talking about motion is the linear velocity equation. Linear velocity is the change in position of an object. So if I move my hand from here to here, it has displaced itself. It's moved some distance in a particular direction. If I put the shot and it leaves my hand and it lands 20 feet away, then it displaced itself horizontally by 20 feet. And then, of course, we have to take into consideration when that position change occurs, how much time did it take? So the further something moves and the quicker it moves through that distance or displacement, the faster it was moving. So we sort of think more about speed. Velocity is just a way of saying how far something moves or how fast something moves and in what direction is it moving in. And direction is important because we have to factor in gravity, which acts only in a vertical direction, from horizontal movement, from lateral movements. So when we think about vertical motions, we have to make sure gravity is a consideration. So gravity is a velocity producer in many cases. So that was linear velocity. That's point-to-point movement. In sport, like tennis or golf or various sports of that nature, rotational velocity is a critical consideration because we have to be able to rotate the body and body parts and sometimes clubs and rackets and things of that nature in order to perform the task at hand. So rotational velocity is equal to rotational displacement divided by time, and it's represented in the biomechanics world with the Greek letter omega. So rotational displacement would be, if I'm looking at my shoulder and my upper arm, how much did my arm rotate between where it started and where it finished? And then how much time did it take to go from here to here? Let me use my left arm. It doesn't hurt quite as bad when I do that. So if I do this, there's a certain rotational velocity. So I went through about 180 degrees, and let's just say it took 2 seconds. But if I do this 180 degrees and it takes 1 second, I move twice as fast. And if I do this in 1/4 of a second, then the rotational velocity was even greater. And to move faster and faster and faster requires more and more and more muscular force to be generated. And with more muscular force comes the potential for muscle injury or injury to joints. And so in high velocity sports like tennis serves, this is a great consideration. But there is a relationship between those two variables. And this is a critical relationship to understand, not just from an injury perspective, but also from a performance perspective. Because what we're very oftentimes asking athletes to do is to make something go fast linearly when they need to hit it or release it. So if you're hitting a golf ball, you want your club head to be going as fast as possible when it hits the ball. The greater the club head speed, everything else being equal, the further the ball is going to fly. Same with tennis serve. The faster the tennis racket is going when it hits the ball, the faster the ball is going to leave the racket. The faster the shot is going when it leaves the hand, the further it's going to fly through the air before it hits the ground. So to make that linear velocity of the hand, the racket, the shot, or whatever go higher and higher, we have to consider these two variables, the radius r and the angular velocity omega. So r relates to how long the lever that's being rotated is. So again, looking at my arm, if you go from shoulder to fingertip, that's a particular value r. But if I shorten that arm by flexing my elbow, I've made that r value shorter. And so I can rotate like this, or I can rotate like this. And you know from experience that this one's harder to do than this one, because there's greater resistance offered by a longer lever. But nevertheless, regardless of how long that lever is, the faster we can rotate it, the greater we can make the linear velocity at the end of the lever. So my fingertip. So if I were throwing a ball or putting a shot, the faster my fingertip is going because of the length of the arm and the rotational velocity at which I've been able to move it, then the further the shot's going to fly or the faster the ball is going to leave my hand. So V equals linear velocity, R equals the length of the radius for the segment, and omega equals the rotational velocity. So in a sport here like goalball, the faster that this gentleman can rotate, and it's more complex than this, but the faster he can rotate his arm from the shoulder, from where he prepared the arm back here, and then accelerated it by building up angular velocity to here, the faster the ball is going to leave his hand. And so his coordination, his ability to create force, and all those things around the shoulder become very, very critical. Now, I always tell my students, and they always want to make money. I said, I can give you just enough information that I can make you rich. So I'm going to give you details, and this was when I was in Georgia, I'm going to give you details about all the high school baseball teams or high school softball teams in Georgia. I'm going to give you a roster of their pitchers. And I want you to go out and recruit pitchers for me. I'm the Atlanta Braves. I want to find some young prospects. So I give all of them a roster, but I tell them nothing else about the athletes on those rosters. They've never heard anything at all about them play. So let me pose that to you. You guys want to get rich and find me some future professional athletes? What's the first thing you're going to look for when you look at that roster? How tall are they? Why? Why does height matter with a high school baseball pitcher?
Because you have two people of different heights and their rotational velocity is the same. The length of the arm is going to increase your velocity.
There you go. So you may strike out 12 times. You may find some kid 6'4", but he's uncoordinated. He's got the R, but he doesn't have the ability to generate the omega because he's uncoordinated. But you keep looking and you keep looking, and finally, boom, there he is. And maybe he doesn't throw strikes really well right now, but we can train him to throw strikes better. We can fine-tune that. So in some cases, anthropometrics, body build, body dimensions, make a difference in that performance perspective. But as we're trying to make those athletes move faster and faster, we're also causing their muscles to create more and more force. And so therein lies the dilemma. Having a bigger V is better. Having a bigger omega is better. Having long R's is better. But all of those things come at the expense of having to create more energy, more motion, and more force to make it all happen. Well, this is all governed by Newton's laws of motion. The first law, y'all didn't realize you were going to get a full physics lesson when you came in here today, did you? First law of inertia. A body will remain at rest or maintain a constant velocity unless acted upon by an external force that changes that state of motion. This guy here in blue is going to stand there like the Rock of Gibraltar until the guy in white grabs him and puts him on the ground. So he wants to stay where he is, so it takes an external force from outside his body to move him, to overcome his inertia. You guys are getting kind of comfortable now, aren't you? So if I had said suddenly, fire, and you had to get up and run, it's going to take effort to get up out of your chair and go, or to roll out of the room if you're in a wheelchair, because you've got inertia. You've got inertia based on the mass of your body. You've got to overcome that mass to get yourself moving. And so in any sort of performance situation, we always have to think about what does it take just to start moving, much less what does it take to really move something at high speed. So we like to keep doing what we're doing, sitting still, and it takes effort to move. But also, once we're moving, once we're walking along or running along, it takes effort to then change direction, or to go faster, or to go slower. So any change in your state of motion requires force. And so the more mass you have, the more challenging it is to change anything about how you're moving. Second law of acceleration. A force applied to a body causes an acceleration of that body of a magnitude proportional to the force in the direction of the force and inversely proportional to the body's mass. And this is the famous F equals ma equation. This is what quantifies force. So when we need to accelerate off the line in our wheelchairs, it's the mass of the performer in the chair, and it's the amount of acceleration required to be an effective wheelchair athlete. So the more force you can create, given your mass, the bigger your acceleration. Once these guys are on the line, their mass is their mass is their mass. They've brought their chair out, they've sat in it, and they put their bodies in it. There's nothing they can do to increase or decrease their weight at that moment. So once that's happened, and they apply force, then they accelerate. So obviously those athletes that are able to produce the biggest forces and do so the quickest are the ones that get off the line the fastest. And assuming that they can sort of maintain that for the rest of the race, they win the race. Now, some athletes don't start as well as others. Oscar Pistorius is a terrible starter. He doesn't start at all well from the blocks. A lot better now than he used to. But my God, once he gets up to speed, there's nobody on the earth that can run faster than him. Nobody. So he doesn't have the ability to create the force coming out of the blocks because of his double prostheses. So those things have to be taken into consideration. So obviously being stronger is an advantage in terms of generating those sorts of forces. And then the last law, the law of action and reaction. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. When one body exerts a force on a second, the second body exerts a reaction that is equal in magnitude and opposite in direction of the first body. When I got up this morning, I weighed myself, stood on the bathroom scale, and it said 128 pounds. Wait a minute. Change what? Oh, change my battery? Okay. I hate it when people call me on that one. Okay, it said 160 pounds. So what does a bathroom scale measure? It measures your mass and how gravity is trying to accelerate you to the center of the earth. So thank God for that bathroom scale, or I'd be in hell right now. So my mass, whatever it is, and gravity, negative 9.8 meters per second squared, my mass equals my body weight. Okay, it's 190. But have you ever stood on a bathroom scale and done this? Try it. What happens when you do this on a bathroom scale? If you've got the old analog, it just kind of goes back and forth above and below your body weight. If you've got a digital scale, if you weigh 150, it goes 170, 140, 170, 140 as you bounce up and down. So when we start to accelerate our bodies, change from standing at attention, hoping that if we just suck our guts in and hold our breath, the scale will be lighter. As soon as we start moving, it's going to be more than that. So when somebody jumps in the air doing a vertical jump in basketball or volleyball or whatever, they have to generate more than their body weight just to jump. And the more force they can produce against the ground or the court, the higher they can jump. But they don't produce nearly as much force jumping as they do landing. They might produce 3 or 4 times their body weight to jump, but they might produce 6 or 7 times their body weight when they land. So if you weigh 200 pounds and you're producing 5 times your body weight, that's 1,000 pounds of force being applied. So with any activity in which force is applied, always remember that the forces are equal and opposite. If I turn and run as fast as I can into the wall is going to feel the same force my head's going to feel. I'm going to lose because it's got a lot bigger mass than I do. My head's harder than that wall probably, but I'd lose from the mass perspective. So another thing we have to take into consideration. Mechanical behavior of bodies in contact with surfaces. Again, just talking more about forces. Frictional force. We can't come out of the blocks, we can't run, we can't walk down the street unless we can generate friction through our feet or through our wheels or through our crutches or whatever to the surface on which we are interacting. So frictional forces are a product of mu times r. Mu is what's called the coefficient of friction. That's just a fancy way of saying what's the sort of roughness between the two surfaces. So if you start rubbing your hands together, you'll feel that coefficient of friction. I'm not going to tell you to do this, don't actually do it, but if you spit in your hands and did that, you would reduce your coefficient of friction, right? If you step out on ice, you have a low coefficient of friction. You're much more likely to slip than if you're walking down a regular concrete sidewalk. R is the normal reaction force. And without getting into too much detail, that's just basically how much force is being applied perpendicularly or directly into the surface. So if you're heavier, you're likely to have greater frictional forces than if you're lighter. But if you're directing your forces straight down into the ground, you're going to have more frictional force than if you're doing it at an angle. So when you try to push off in running, you don't have as much frictional force as when you're standing straight up. because the angle at which you're pushing is different. So that's why it's important to have starting blocks when you get into a position like this, because you're not really directing your force in such a way in that position where you can create force effectively unless you have the block. So frictional forces are critical. We don't want so much that it's hard to move, but we've got to have enough so that we can move. Too little, we slip and fall. But we don't want a whole lot of friction force when we play ice hockey or sled hockey or do downhill skiing, because otherwise we wouldn't move on those surfaces. Another factor that comes into play in this consideration of injury and performance is mechanical behavior of bodies that are in contact with one another, whether it's constant contact or through an impact. And that's linear momentum. Linear momentum is mass times velocity. So again, sort of like force, mass times acceleration, mass is how much matter the object has. So your body weight is directly proportional to your mass. The 16-pound shot has more mass than the 12-pound shot, et cetera, et cetera. But what's important here is velocity. The faster the object is moving, the more momentum it has. And so the more momentum it has, the more difficult it is to stop it from moving. So while it's hard to generate the movement, to get it moving, once it's starting to move, then it becomes more difficult to stop. So again, in challenging athletes to go faster and faster and faster, we're creating more and more and more momentum. And when we have to stop that momentum, then we've got to create the forces necessary to stop that momentum. So why do baseball pitchers and tennis players get rotator cuff injuries? We ask them to throw a baseball or a softball or swing a tennis racket as fast as they can, trying to generate club head speed and ball speed, etc. And then particularly with baseball players, when they release the ball, they better darn well be ready to catch it if it comes right back at them, because a hitter can hit the ball back at them faster than they can throw it towards the hitter. And so if they can't get out of the way or field the ball, the chances of getting hit between the eyes is pretty large. So they can't have a long, drawn-out follow-through. They've got to be sort of abrupt in their follow-through just to be ready to field the ball, whether it's to protect themselves or to get it for a bunt or whatever. In the same way with a tennis player, the ball's going to come back at him or her if the player's able to return the shot. So they've got to be ready for that next stroke. So obviously those sorts of situations can themselves lead to injury potential. So great or large momentum can be a factor. So if momentum changes for an athlete, it is typically because their velocity changes and not their mass. So in other words, just like those wheelchair athletes on the starting line, once you're in the heat of the game, your mass doesn't change. So any change in momentum is because of changes in velocity that are occurring. And those changes in velocity are occurring either because of muscular activity to slow it down or to speed it back up or whatever, or because of collisions with other individuals or other objects. And obviously we realize that in collision situations that can change momentum, the possibility for injuries are increased. So therefore, to increase velocity or momentum, one must create force over a period of time, which leads to acceleration. So if you need to build up your momentum, you have to apply force, and you've got to apply that force in some period of time. Now, can anybody tell me a sport where time isn't of the essence in terms of generating that momentum necessary to achieve success? Let's just say you're a basketball player and the ball is passed to you and you think, okay, I'm going to take a shot. So you catch the ball, you say, okay, I think I'll jump now. You jump and you shoot. What's going to happen? Bam! They're going to block your shot because you took too much time to do your activity. So a good jump shooter in basketball catches the ball up in the air, shoots the ball before the opposing player can get in his or her face. So they have to create as much force as possible to jump high, but they've got to do it quickly. Okay? Everybody generally agree with that? How about a high jump? How about a high jump? Do you have to create the force quickly? Well, you don't have to, but you probably need to. But you can spend more time than the basketball player did in creating your force to jump. But then again, it all depends upon how you're jumping. And if you're running up to the bar to jump, you've got to be able to create the force to get off the ground, and you can't take forever. You can't have some incredible range of motion. You can't squat all the way down like this and then try to jump from that position because of other anatomical sorts of factors. So, as a general rule, when you're trying to create powerful movements, you have to create forces rather quickly. So it's a force factor, but it's also a time factor. So the more force created in, or the longer the time the force is applied, the more the acceleration that will occur. But bear in mind that those time frames might be very small. So that leads me to this graph and formula, which is really critically important to understand. If you need to change your momentum, to speed up, to slow down, linearly or angularly, it's called impulse. Impulse is what I get sometimes too when I go into an electronics store. I get the impulse to buy something. Jeff can attest to that. Impulse is force times time. So impulse changes momentum. So force times time changes momentum. So if you need to increase your momentum or decrease your momentum, it can fall on what you do with the force. Make the force go up or make the force go down. But then how quickly your velocity changes or your momentum changes might be dictated by the time over which that force was applied. So I can put a ball in my hand in this position, intending to throw it to my cameraman back there, and I'm going to move through a range and I'll release it. So here it goes. So it took whatever time it took. Or I can do this. Which one do you suppose created a bigger change in momentum? The first one or the second one? The second, the same range of motion, but it moved through the distance much more rapidly. So there was more force applied, and the force was applied very rapidly. So what happened was, I got a big force in a short amount of time. Whereas with the first one, I had a smaller force in a longer period of time. Well, in this scenario, what's critically important is being able to visualize the area underneath the curve. So just for the sake of argument, in this particular example, under the black curve and under the red curve, the areas are exactly the same. So if the area under that force time curve is exactly the same, then the momentum change at the end was the same. Okay, you're going around recruiting again for me. I need some good rowing athletes. So what are you going to look for? Well, stature is important with rowers just as it is with throwers. But if I can give you impulse curves on all of those people that you're going to go see, which ones are you going to go visit first? Are you going to go visit the individuals that fall under the black area or under the red area?
Red.
Why red?
Longer endurance. I can continue longer.
Well, let me make sure you're understanding my graph here. This is for one stroke. One stroke. So why black? Exactly right. Big force, quick. That's what denotes a power athlete. Just like the basketball player. You want the black curve or the red curve for your jump shooter? Get up quick. So when you need power, when you need force or momentum change to occur rapidly, then you need big force happening quickly. Now, I used to like to tell my students, my name is, and maybe there are a few of you in the room that'll remember this. You remember the guy from the '88 Olympic Games named Ben Johnson from Canada? I hate that guy. Yeah. So I would tell my students that I had a race with my arch enemy, Ben Johnson. And before we went on the track, we both went in the lab and we did all of our testing, and I found out I could create the same impulse as him, even when he was on steroids. our curves were tested, and my area was the same as his area. And we got out on the track, and the gun went off, and we started running down the track, and all I saw was the rear end on him as he went down the track. What's the problem? We can create the same impulse. Well, whatever that time is, let's say that's 1,000th of a second. It took me 1,000th of a second longer to create my impulse than him. What does that mean? Every time my foot hit the ground, I lost 1,000th of a second to my arch enemy. And so how many times does your foot hit the ground in running 100 meters? Or a marathon, or 10,000 meters? So if you're losing 1,000th of a second each time your foot hits the ground, you're going to lose by however many times your foot hits the ground times 1,000th of a second. And maybe it's only 1/10 of a second at the end of the race, or a half second or whatever. So just because you can create the impulse doesn't mean necessarily that you're going to be elite. Make sense? So if we can recruit athletes that have the faster twitch muscle fibers, you ever heard that term, fast twitch muscle versus slow twitch muscle? So sprinters have lots of fast twitch muscle tissue, and distance runners have more slow twitch. So obviously sprinters are able to run faster than distance runners. Stability and balance. Sorry to be moving so rapidly here, but I need to get the physics out of the way so we can talk about the injury. Stability and balance. Factors that affect your stability are mass, friction, where your center of gravity is located, and where your base of support is. So this all sort of falls into the notion of balance. Foot position affects standing balance. Wheelchair wheel width, depth, side to side, and front to back affect balance. So if you widen your base of support, you might be more stable. But if I widen my base of support like this, I'm only more stable this way. I'm not more stable this way. In fact, I'm probably less stable this way in the grand scheme of things. So if we're playing football and you're opposing me, I'm sorry?
Also shorter.
Yeah, and that helps.
In basketball,
Now,
that's huge.
see, y'all laughed at my weight. Now he's calling me short. If we're playing football and I want to know that I'm going to have a collision with this person, I'm going to widen my base because that's where the force is going to come from. But if I think that she's going to be producing the force and all of a sudden she comes out of nowhere, what's going to happen? Boom, I'm going over because I widen my base right here. I'm not wide at all this direction. So so what you do with your base of support becomes a very critical issue. So you know that there are different kinds of base of support for different kinds of sporting activities and the like. So here are some examples. Good and bad. Well, one of the critical things to understand here in terms of force production and the potential for energy, but also how it affects performance, is resistance to motion. And I've alluded to this already with Newton's first law. Mass and rotational inertia. The resistance to movement for linear acceleration or linear motion is directly related to your mass, or the mass of any object that you're considering. So the more weight it has, the more resistance it offers. When you're thinking about rotational motion or rotational acceleration, it's not just your mass or the mass of the object that you're trying to move. It's also the length of the object, if you thought about it as a lever. But then also, how is the weight distributed within that lever? So think about the typical softball or baseball bat. You got a little skinny handle with a knob where you hold the bat, and then it kind of gets bigger and fatter towards the end where you actually make contact with the ball. So it's an oddly shaped implement, if you will. So it's got mass, you can weigh it and you can calculate what its mass is. It's got length, there's shorter bats and longer bats, and then it's got different distribution of weight. So if all your little league team can afford is one bat, and you got some little skinny, scrawny kids and you got some bigger kids, what do you do with that bat? Well, the skinny, scrawny kids choke up, and the other kids might hold it down towards the end of the bat. So just by changing effectively how the mass is distributed based on where you hold it, you've made the bat seem lighter than it really is. So again, we go back to those taller baseball players that we're recruiting that have the longer arms. It's harder for them to rotate those long arms than it is for someone shorter. But if you can find that person that can rotate their segments with longer arms as fast as someone who is shorter with shorter arms, those are the professional baseball pitchers. Usain Bolt, that runs Olympic able-bodied competitions, is extraordinary. He is 6'4", I think, and has incredibly long limbs. Now, when I think about the typical long-legged individual athlete, they aren't typically thought of as the fast sprinter types. You know, think about some of the centers in professional basketball running up and down the court. They labor to run. It's because they've got these big, huge, long legs that are hard to rotate. But you think about the point guards that can scurry all over, and you think, wow. Now, those guys are quick. I mean, they're still big, many of them, but their legs aren't as long as are the centers. So Usain Bolt is really an oddity because he's got these long legs, but man, he can turn those legs over. So he's got that rare combination of high fast twitch fibers, coordination, the whole sort of 9 yards. Yeah, question?
Is this the same, I guess, principle that would explain why pitchers aren't good hitters, typically?
It could be, but it's probably more just experience, not playing, not hitting, not taking batting practice. Oftentimes pitchers are like quarterbacks in football. They're the best athletes, but if you don't let them practice their trade, and they don't oftentimes get to practice. So they might have been great hitters through high school and college and then got into the professional ranks and just hardly ever swung a bat again. The same sort of notion is with things like tennis serves and with golf swings, etc. When you get into a back scratch position, what you're trying to do is to reduce your resistance to rotation because of how you're distributing the mass and how you're sort of changing limb length. But you realize that as you're accelerating the body in that back scratch position, eventually you've got to do this. And you've got to do that because of V equals R omega. When you actually hit the ball, you've got to have a long limb again. So, again, those are sort of the phases of movement. Yes, sir?
One of the things I noticed this year in wheelchair basketball was that a bunch of my players were beginning to deal with rotator cuff strain.
Mm-hmm.
Is that because of the artificial impediment of the back of the chair? In other words, they're short arm and everything.
Yep.
And so as the season would go on, I could tell that even though their upper body is so developed from pushing the chair for so long.
That's an excellent question and observation. I'm an old baseball player than weightlifter, and when I lifted weights, I love to do bench press. And so it's almost like the chair users doing bench presses constantly. They're not building the posterior aspects of their shoulder. So anybody that's doing weightlifting needs to make sure they take care of the back of the shoulder as well as the front of the shoulder, because what happens is you get into all sorts of muscle imbalances, etc., and eventually that comes back to haunt you. And that's a common problem with chair users, particularly chair users that get into really high dynamic sport like wheelchair basketball, wheelchair rugby, etc. So that's a common problem across a lot of different sports.
So if I've got a guy working with training for wheelchair basketball athletes, he needs to make sure that he's working that posterior.
Yeah, doing those upright rows and those sorts of activities that work the posterior aspects. So javelin is a good example of what I was just talking about. It goes from a long lever to that short lever to that long lever. So a lot of resistance to motion, a lot of very little resistance during that sort of cocking phase, and then more resistance with release. But again, that comes into technique. So back to momentum just very quickly. Linear momentum is M equals mv. Rotational inertia is H equals I omega. So I is rotational inertia. It's the equivalent of mass in the rotational world. Angular velocity is the equivalent of linear velocity in the linear world. So this is that factor that's mass, length of lever, and mass distribution. So how we change parts of our body become very, very critical in this factor. And so by simply going from here where there's a big I to here where there's a smaller I to here where there's a very small I can greatly change how fast I rotate. So think about an ice skater. They rotate slowly like this. They start bringing the arms in. They go faster and faster and faster. Woo! That didn't change. That did not change while I did all of that. But that did, and that did. And so when an athlete like a javelin thrower is throwing that javelin, their angular momentum for the most part stays the same between takeoff or start and release. But the components that make that momentum change based on how they redistribute their mass. Okay, we're going to do a tape change.